The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the old hospital building. Its once pristine white walls were now a dull grey, covered in patches of mold and creeping vines. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mingled with the musty odor of decay. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. It was in this unsettling atmosphere that the story of Room 13 began to unfold. The hospital had a reputation that preceded it. Whispers among the staff spoke of strange occurrences, patients who vanished without a trace, and rooms that were perpetually cold despite the central heating. Among these tales, the most chilling was the one about Room 13. It was said that anyone who spent the night in Room 13 would never be the same again. Some claimed they saw apparitions, others spoke of hearing disembodied voices. But the most terrifying accounts were from those who had encountered a presence so malevolent it drove them to the brink of madness. Dr. Sato was new to the hospital. A dedicated physician, he was driven by a desire to uncover the truth behind the hospital's dark legends. He was joined by Nurse Aki, a seasoned nurse with a nonsense attitude, who had seen her fair share of strange things, but preferred to keep her head down and do her job. Together, they formed an unlikely team, united by their curiosity and a shared sense of duty. The night they decided to investigate Room 13 was particularly cold. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, and the power had gone out several times throughout the day. Armed with flashlights and a sense of resolve, Dr. Sato and Nurse Aki made their way to the infamous room. The door to Room 13 was old and heavy, creaking ominously as Dr. Sato pushed it open. The room inside was bare, save for a single bed, a wooden chair, and a small bedside table. The air was noticeably colder, and both of them shivered involuntarily as they stepped inside. Dr. Sato's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, there was an undeniable sense of being watched, a prickling on the back of the neck that set their nerves on edge. They decided to stay in the room for the night. As the hours passed, the room remained eerily silent. The only sounds were their own breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling. Just as they were beginning to think the stories were nothing more than mess, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the air. "Help me!" The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to send a chill down their spines. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aki exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. They had come too far to turn back now. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from all directions at once, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Dr. Sato approached the bed, examining it closely. There was nothing unusual about it, just a standard hospital bed with clean sheets. But as he leaned closer, he noticed something odd about the headboard. Etched into the wood were tiny scratches, almost as if someone had been clawing at it in desperation. Nurse Aki, meanwhile, was drawn to the small bedside table. She opened the drawer and found a worn, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with the frantic scrawl of a patient long forgotten. The entries were disjointed, filled with ramblings about shadows and voices. But one passage stood out. "I can feel it watching me. It whispers to me at night, telling me things I don't want to hear. I can't escape it. No one believes me. I am trapped." As she read the words aloud, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Their breath became visible, small clouds of vapor in the cold air. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. "Help us, free us." The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing closer, the darkness growing thicker. Dr. Sato felt a pressure on his chest, as if an invisible force was trying to crush him. He struggled to breathe, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. In the dim light, he saw Nurse Aki's face, pale and terrified, her eyes wide with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped. The room returned to its previous silence, the oppressive darkness lifting slightly. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki were left gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We need to get out of here," Nurse Aiki said, her voice trembling. Dr. Sato nodded, but as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the floor, where his flashlight had fallen, was a small, old-fashioned key. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up, examining it closely. It was made of brass, tarnished with age, and felt heavy in his hand. There was an inscription on the key, but it was too worn to make out the words. Dr. Sato felt a surge of curiosity. What did this key open? Was it connected to the haunting of Room 13? Despite their fear, they knew they couldn't leave now. There were too many unanswered questions, and they were determined to uncover the truth. They spent the rest of the night in the room, but the whispering didn't return. As dawn broke, they left the room, exhausted but resolute. Over the next few days, Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki delved into the hospital's history, searching for any clues about the key and the haunting. They discovered that Room 13 had once been the office of a doctor who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. His disappearance was never solved, and his office had been converted into a patient room after his vanishing. Intrigued, they decided to search the old hospital records for more information. In the dusty archives, they found a file on the missing doctor. His name was Dr. Nakamura, and he was known for his unconventional methods and obsession with the supernatural. He believed that the hospital was built on a site with a dark past, and he had conducted numerous experiments to prove his theories. Among the records, they found a journal, similar to the one Nurse Aiki had discovered in Room 13. It was filled with detailed notes on his experiments, his belief that the hospital was haunted, and his attempts to communicate with the spirits. One entry stood out. "I have found the key. It opens a door to the other side. I must proceed with caution, for there are forces at play here that I do not fully understand. But I am close, so close to uncovering the truth." Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki realized that the key they found was the same one mentioned in Dr. Nakamura's journal. It was a key to a hidden door, a portal to the other side. But where was this door, and what awaited them on the other side? Their search led them to an old storage room in the basement of the hospital. It was a room that had been long forgotten, filled with old medical equipment and dusty files. In the corner, hidden behind a stack of boxes, they found a door. It was small and unassuming, but there was something about it that felt wrong, as if it didn't belong. With trembling hands, Dr. Sato inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud click, and the door creaked open. Beyond it was a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the hospital. They exchanged a glance, steeling themselves for what lay ahead, and descended into the darkness. The air grew colder and heavier as they descended the steps, creaking under their weight. The walls were lined with old, flickering lights, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted. At the bottom of the stairs, they found another door, this one larger and more ornate, with strange symbols carved into the wood. Dr. Sato took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast and empty, save for a single figure standing in the center. It was a man, tall and thin, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. He turned to face them, and they recognized him immediately from the photos in the archive. It was Dr. Nakamura. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "You have the key. You can set us free." The room seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki felt a sense of dread wash over them. They had uncovered the truth, but it was far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. They realized that the key was not just a physical object, but a symbol of their connection to the other side. By unlocking the door, They had opened a portal to a realm of spirits and shadows, a place where the dead were trapped and seeking release. Dr. Nakamura stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Help us," he whispered. "Free us from this torment." The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach out, grasping at them. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki knew they had to act quickly. With a sense of determination, they stepped forward, holding the key tightly in their hands. As they approached the center of the room, the shadows began to recede, the darkness lifting. Dr. Nakamura's form wavered, becoming translucent, and the room filled with a soft, otherworldly light. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. And then he was gone. The room returned to its previous state, empty and silent. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. They had done it. They had freed the spirits trapped in the hospital. As they made their way back up the stairs, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. The air was lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. They had faced their fears and uncovered the truth, and in doing so, they had brought peace to the restless spirits of the hospital. But the experience had changed them. They knew that the hospital would never be the same, that the haunting of Room 13 was just the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions, many mysteries yet to be solved. And so they continued their work, determined to uncover the secrets of the hospital and bring peace to those who were trapped in the shadows. The days following their harrowing experience in Room 13 were a blur for Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki. The hospital, with its usual bustling activity, seemed to carry an air of uneasy calm. The other staff members went about their routines, unaware of the dark secrets that had been unearthed just below their feet. Despite the relative normalcy, both Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki found it difficult to shake off. The feeling of being watched, every shadow seemed deeper, every creak in the old building more ominous. Yet, their curiosity and sense of duty propelled them forward. They knew they had only scratched the surface of the hospital's mysteries, and the key they had found was just the beginning. That was rarely used. It was a section that had been closed off for renovations years ago, but the work was never completed. The hallways were dusty, the paint peeling from the walls, and the smell of dampness hung in the air. It was here that they hoped to find more clues about Dr. Nakamura and his experiments. As they walked through the abandoned corridors, they found an old records room. The door was locked, but with a bit of effort, they managed to force it open. Inside, they discovered a treasure trove of old files, journals and documents, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear that no one had been in this room for years. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki spent hours poring over the documents. Among the records, they found detailed notes on patients who had been treated in Room 13. Many of these patients had reported similar experiences, hearing voices, feeling cold spots, and seeing apparitions. The records also mentioned several unexplained disappearances, patients who had simply vanished without a trace. One file, in particular, caught their attention. It was a thick dossier on a young woman named Keiko, who had been admitted to the hospital with severe depression. According to the records, she had been placed in Room 13 for observation. Her journal entries, included in the file, detailed her descent into madness as she described the voices and shadows that tormented her. The last entry was particularly chilling. "I can't take it anymore. The voices won't stop. They're telling me to do things, terrible things. I have to get out of here, but I'm trapped. Please, if anyone finds this, help me." The date of the entry was the same day Keiko had disappeared. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only her desperate words. Nurse Aiki's eyes filled with tears as she read Keiko's final plea. "We have to find out what happened to her," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We can't let her story end like this." Dr. Saito nodded, his resolve hardening. "There has to be more," he said. "We need to find out what Dr. Nakamura was doing in Room 13. Maybe that will give us some answers." Their search led them to another room, hidden behind a false wall in the basement. It was a small, cluttered laboratory, filled with old medical equipment and strange devices. On a table in the center of the room, they found a stack of notebooks, each filled with Nakamura's meticulous handwriting. As they read through the notebooks, they discovered the true extent of Dr. Nakamura's experiments. He had been convinced that the hospital was built on a site with a dark past, a place where terrible things had happened. He believed that the spirits of those who had suffered were trapped within the hospital's walls, and he had been determined to communicate with them. Dr. Nakamura's notes detailed his experiments with various methods of spirit communication, including seances, Ouija boards, and electronic voice phenomena. He had also conducted numerous psychological experiments on his patients, pushing them to their mental limits in an attempt to make contact with the other side. It was clear from his notes that Dr. Nakamura had become increasingly obsessed with his work. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing apparitions, and feeling a constant, oppressive presence. His last entry was particularly disturbing. "I am so close to uncovering the truth. The spirits are angry, but they are communicating with me. I must continue, no matter the cost. I must find the key to their release." Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki exchanged a worried glance. It was clear that Dr. Nakamura's obsession had driven him to madness, but it also confirmed their suspicions that there was something deeply wrong with the hospital. Determined to uncover the full extent of Dr. Nakamura's experiments, they continued to search the hidden laboratory. In a locked cabinet, they found a series of tapes, labeled with dates and patient names. These were recordings of Dr. Nakamura's sessions with his patients, including Kiko. They took the tapes to a nearby room where they found an old tape player. As they listened to the recordings, they heard Dr. Nakamura's voice, calm and methodical, asking his patients about their experiences in room 13. The patients' voices, however, were filled with fear and desperation. Keiko's tape was the most chilling. She spoke of the voices that tormented her, describing them as a chorus of whispers that never cease. She talked about seeing shadows moving in the corners of her vision and feeling cold hands touching her in the dark. "I can't take it anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "They want something from me, but I don't know what it is. Please make them stop." Dr. Nakamura's voice was calm and reassuring. "You're doing very well, Keiko. We're making progress. Just a little longer." The tape ended abruptly, leaving Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki in a stunned silence. It was clear that Dr. Nakamura had been pushing his patients beyond their limits, driving them to the brink of madness in his quest to communicate with the spirits. As they sat in the dimly lit room, they felt a growing sense of unease. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around them deepened. It was as if the spirits themselves were aware of their presence, watching and waiting. "We need to leave," Nurse Aiki said, her voice trembling. "We've found enough. We can take this to the authorities and let them handle it." Dr. Sato nodded, but as they stood to leave, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The tape player began to play on its own, the sound of Kiko's desperate pleas filling the room. "Help me, please, help me." The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the cold air. The shadows seemed to move, closing in around them. They could feel the presence of something malevolent, something that wanted to keep them there. Desperate, Dr. Sato grabbed the tapes and the notebooks, shoving them into a bag. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice tight with fear. They ran to the door, struggling to open it against an unseen force. Finally, with a burst of strength, they managed to wrench it open and stumbled out into the hallway. As they fled the basement, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of being watched remained. They knew they had uncovered something terrible, something that did not want to be revealed. Back in the safety of Dr. Sato's office, they went through the materials they had gathered. It was clear that Dr. Nakamura had been involved in something far beyond his understanding, and his experiments had unleashed a dark force within the hospital. They knew they couldn't keep this to themselves. The next day, they contacted the authorities and handed over the tapes and notebooks. An investigation was launched, and the hospital's administration was forced to confront the dark history that had been hidden for so long. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details came to light. It was revealed that the hospital had been built on the site of an old temple, where terrible rituals had been performed. The spirits of those who had suffered were trapped within the hospital's walls, seeking release. The authorities decided to close off the old section of the hospital. Deeming it too dangerous for use, plans were made to conduct a thorough cleansing of the building, to rid it of the dark presence that haunted its halls. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki were commended for their bravery and dedication, but the experience had left its mark on them. They had faced the darkness and uncovered the truth, but they knew that some mysteries were better left undiscovered. As the hospital returned to its routine, the old section remained closed, a silent reminder of the dark secrets that lay hidden within. The story of Room 13 and Dr. Nakamura's experiments became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of delving too deeply into the unknown. But for Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki, the memory of their encounter with the spirits of the hospital would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The weeks following the discovery in the hidden laboratory were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki continued to work at the hospital, but their nights were often consumed with nightmares of what they had uncovered. The old section of the hospital had been sealed off, yet the eerie feeling of being watched lingered. One rainy evening, Dr. Saito sat at his desk, staring at the scattered papers and photographs from their investigation. The flickering light of his desk lamp cast long shadows, and the sound of rain tapping against the window added to the somber mood. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Nurse Aiki knocked softly on the door before entering. "I can't stop thinking about Keiko and the others," she said, her voice filled with concern. "There has to be something more we can do." Dr. Saito nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I've been going over Dr. Nakamura's notes again," he said. "There are references to an old shrine in the forest nearby. It's said to be connected to the hospital's dark history." They decided to visit the shrine, hoping to find more answers. The next morning, they set out early, the sky still overcast and the air damp with the remnants of the night's rain. The path to the shrine was overgrown, and the forest seemed to close in around them as they walked. The trees, tall and ancient, blocked out most of the light, casting a gloomy pallor over everything. After an hour of trudging through the dense forest, they finally reached the shrine. It was a small, decrepit structure, overgrown with ivy and moss. The wooden torii gate was weathered and cracked, and the stone lanterns on either side were covered in thick green moss. A sense of unease settled over them as they approached. Dr. Saito pushed open the creaky wooden door, revealing a dark interior. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves. In the center of the shrine was an ancient altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. On the altar sat a small, ornate box. Nurse Aiki approached the box cautiously, her hands trembling. She lifted the lid, revealing a collection of old scrolls and a small, intricately carved wooden statue. The statue depicted a figure with a twisted, malevolent expression, its eyes seeming to follow them as they moved. Dr. Saito unrolled one of the scrolls, his eyes scanning the faded characters. "It's a record of sacrifices," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This shrine was used for dark rituals to appease vengeful spirits." Nurse Aiki shuddered, stepping back from the altar. "We need to take this back to the hospital," she said. "Maybe it will help us understand what's happening." They carefully packed the scrolls and the statue, then made their way back to the hospital. As they walked, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and the sounds of the forest becoming eerily silent. Back at the hospital, they laid out the scrolls on Dr. Sato's desk. The characters were difficult to read, worn with age. But together they managed to piece together the story. The shrine had been built centuries ago on the site of a massacre. A group of villagers had been slaughtered by a local warlord, their spirits trapped and vengeful. The shrine was erected to contain their anger, with regular sacrifices made to keep the spirits at bay. As time passed, the rituals were forgotten and the shrine fell into disrepair. When the hospital was built on the same site, the spirit's anger was reignited, leading to the strange occurrences and disappearances. Dr. Nakamura had discovered this history and, in his obsession, had attempted to communicate with the spirits, inadvertently unleashing their wrath. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual," Dr. Sato said. "If we can appease the spirits, maybe we can finally bring peace to this place." Nurse Aiki nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. They decided to perform the ritual that night, hoping the cover of darkness would help conceal their actions from any curious onlookers. The hospital's administration had become increasingly wary of their investigations, and they didn't want to attract any more attention. As night fell, they gathered the necessary items: candles, incense, and offerings of food and drink. They made their way to the old section of the hospital, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The air grew colder as they approached room 13, and the sense of unease grew stronger. They set up the ritual in the center of the room, placing the statue on a small table surrounded by candles. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the scent of incense filled the air. Dr. Sato began to chant, his voice low and steady, reciting the words from the scrolls. Nurse Aiki joined in, her voice trembling but determined. As they chanted, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath became visible, and the shadows seemed to dance around them. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A low guttural moan filled the air, and the temperature dropped even further. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki continued to chant, their voices rising above the din. The moaning grew louder, and they could feel a presence in the room. With them, something ancient and angry. The table began to shake, the offerings toppling to the floor. The statue seemed to glow with an eerie light, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Dr. Sato's voice grew stronger, his words echoing in the small room. "Spirits of the past, we seek to bring you peace. Accept our offerings and leave this place." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air crackling with static. The moaning grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The candles flickered back to life, casting a soft glow over the room. The temperature began to rise, and the sense of malevolence faded. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki exchanged a glance, relief washing over them. "It worked," Nurse Aiki said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Sato nodded, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. But their relief was short-lived. As they began to clean up, a loud crash echoed through the room. They turned to see the statue lying on the floor, shattered into pieces. A cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles once more. A voice, low and filled with rage, echoed in the darkness. "You cannot escape us. We will have our revenge." The temperature plummeted again, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki backed towards the door, their hearts pounding with fear. They knew they had angered the spirits, and they needed to get out before it was too late. As they fled the room, the air grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting slightly. But they knew the danger was far from over. The spirits were angry, and they would not rest until they had their revenge. Back in the safety of Dr. Sato's office, they tried to come up with a new plan. "We need to find a way to break the curse," Dr. Sato said. "There has to be something we're missing." Nurse Aiki nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. They spent the next few days researching, poring over old records and consulting with experts in the supernatural. It was during one of these consultations that they met Mr. Yamamoto, an elderly man with a deep knowledge of the occult. Mr. Yamamoto listened to their story with a grave expression. "You have disturbed powerful spirits," he said. "They will not rest until they have been appeased. You must find the source of their anger and address it directly." He explained that the spirits were likely angered by the desecration of the shrine and the forgotten rituals. To break the curse, they would need to perform a ritual at the original site of the massacre, acknowledging the spirits' suffering and offering them peace. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki knew it was their only hope. They gathered the necessary items and made their way back to the forest. The path was even more overgrown, the forest darker and more oppressive than before. They reached the shrine, their hearts pounding with fear. As they set up for the ritual, the air grew colder and the sense of unease deepened. They began to chant, their voices steady and strong. The temperature dropped further, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. But they continued, determined to see the ritual through. As they chanted, the air crackled with energy. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse, and the shadows grew darker. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, and the ground split open. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form twisted and malevolent. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki continued to chant, their voices rising above the din. The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering in and out of existence. With a final, desperate effort, they completed the ritual. Offering their apologies and their hope for peace, the figure let out a terrible scream, then vanished, the ground closing up behind it. The air grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki stood in stunned silence, the forest around them eerily quiet. "It's over, Doctor," Saito said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nurse Aiki nodded, tears streaming down her face. They had done it. They had broken the curse. As they made their way back to the hospital, the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow over the forest. The hospital, once a place of darkness and fear, seemed lighter. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki knew there was still work to be done. But for the first time, they felt a sense of hope. The spirits had been appeased, and the hospital could finally begin to heal. But they also knew that some scars would never fully fade. The memory of their encounter with the spirits would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And so they continued their work, determined to honor the spirits and bring peace to those who had suffered. The hospital, once a place of fear, became a place of healing and hope, a testament to the power of courage and compassion. The hospital was quieter now. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly since Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki had performed the ritual in the forest. However, an uneasy calm settled over the place, a feeling that the spirits were not yet fully at peace. Both Dr. Saito and Nurse Aiki sensed that their journey was not over. One evening, as the sun set behind the old building, casting long shadows over the grounds, Dr. Saito received a call. It was Mr. Yamamoto, the elderly man they had consulted about the curse. His voice was grave. "You have done well," he said, "but there is still one thing left to do. The spirits are not fully appeased. You must return to room 13 and confront them one last time." Dr. Saito felt a chill run down his spine. He had hoped they were done with that cursed room, but he knew Mr. Yamamoto was right. He called Nurse Aiki, and they agreed to meet at the hospital later that night. As darkness fell, the two of them stood outside room 13, the cold air biting at their skin. The corridor was silent, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. They took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was as they had left it, the remnants of their previous rituals still scattered around. The air was cold, and the sense of unease was palpable. They set up their candles and incense once more, placing the offerings on a small table in the center of the room. Dr. Saito began to chant, his voice steady and strong. Nurse Aiki joined in, her voice trembling but determined. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. The shadows seemed to move, closing in around them. A low, guttural moan filled the room, and the temperature dropped further. They could feel the presence of the spirits, their anger and pain palpable. Dr. Sato continued to chant, his voice rising above the din. Spirits of the past, we seek to bring you peace. Accept our offerings and leave this place. The moaning grew louder, the shadows growing darker. The candles flickered, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, and the candles went out, plunging them into darkness. A voice, low and filled with rage, echoed in the room. You cannot escape us. We will have our revenge. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki continued to chant, their voices strong and unwavering. We are sorry for your suffering. We offer you peace. Please leave this place. The room seemed to shake, the walls vibrating with a low hum. The moaning grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The candles flickered back to life, casting a soft glow over the room. The temperature began to rise, and the sense of malevolence faded. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki exchanged a glance, relief washing over them. It worked, Nurse Aiki said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Sato nodded, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. But their relief was short-lived. The shadows seemed to gather in the center of the room, forming a dark, twisting mass. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form twisted and malevolent. It was the spirit of Dr. Nakamura. You cannot stop us, he hissed, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. We will have our revenge. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki continued to chant, their voices rising above the din. The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering in and out of existence. With a final, desperate effort, they completed the ritual. Offering their apologies and their hope for peace, the figure let out a terrible scream, then vanished, the shadows dispersing. The air grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting. Dr. Sato and Nurse Aiki stood in stunned silence, the room eerily quiet. It's over, Dr. Sato said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nurse Aiki nodded, tears streaming down her face. They had done it. They had brought peace to the spirits trapped in the hospital. As they made their way out of room 13, the air seemed lighter. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The hospital, once a place of darkness and fear, felt different. The spirits had been appeased, and the hospital could finally begin to heal. But the experience had changed them. They had faced the darkness and uncovered the truth. And in doing so, they had brought peace to the restless spirits of the hospital. They continued their work, determined to honor the spirits and bring peace to those who had suffered. The hospital, once a place of fear, became a place of healing and hope, a testament to the power of courage and compassion. But they also knew that some scars would never fully fade. The memory of their encounter with the spirits would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And so they continued their work, knowing that they had done all they could to bring peace to the haunted hospital. But the lessons they had learned, the courage they had found, would stay with them always. The hospital, once a place of darkness and fear, had become a place of light and hope, thanks to their bravery and determination. And in the end, that was all that mattered.